They gave her a chair at the table. The third time she was right. The first time, they said coincidence. The second time, they said luck. By the third, the chair was already pulled out and nobody said a word, and she sat down like she'd been sitting there all along, which, for the record, she had. I'm going to tell you what she did. I'm going to tell you how she did it. But first I need you to understand the 18 days before she walked into that briefing room. The men we buried. The convoys we stopped running. The specific silence that had settled over Sector 7 like weather that doesn't know it isn't welcome anymore. Because this story doesn't start with brilliance. It starts with a wall of names. 18 of them. Written in black marker on a whiteboard someone had wheeled into the hallway outside my office, because the office itself had run out of room. And it starts with the way she stood in front of that wall. Not crying. Not praying. Not performing grief in any of the ways grief usually performs itself. Just reading. Name by name. Moving her lips slightly, not mouthing the words, something quieter than that, something that wasn't for anyone else in the room. I watched her for 40 seconds before she turned and looked at me. She said, I need a map and a chair and someone who writes things down. I write things down. I've been writing things down for 12 years. It's the only discipline I've maintained without instruction or supervision or anyone checking whether I've done it. I gave her the map. I gave her the chair. What she did with them, what she did with us, with the whole grinding machinery of an operation that had ground itself into paralysis, I've been trying to write down in a way that does it justice ever since. I haven't managed it yet. But I'm going to try again. I keep a field log. Not because the Army requires it, the Army has its own documentation systems, its own redundant bureaucracies, a chain of custody for every piece of paper that passes through a forward operating base. My log is unofficial. Personal. A half-filled notebook I bought in a stationery shop in Lahore 12 years ago that smells, inexplicably and persistently, of cedar and something sweet I've never been able to identify. I've tried. I've opened it in different seasons, in different climates, in rooms that should have neutralized it, and it still carries that smell. I've stopped trying to explain it. Some things hold on to what they came from. I write things down not because I'll use them later. I write them because the act of writing forces me to see what I've been looking at. This is an important distinction. You can look at a thing for 18 days and not see it at all. The first death was Captain Rimat Ullah. He was 31. He had a daughter who'd just turned 4 and a habit of describing her to anyone who stood still long enough, in a tone that suggested he couldn't quite believe she existed. She says probably wrong, he told me once, passing a blurry photograph across a field table, the child in a yellow dress, one shoe off, squinting at whoever was holding the camera. She says probably. I haven't corrected her. I'm not going to. He put the photo back into his left breast pocket and buttoned it shut with the particular care of a man protecting something he understands is temporary. He took her round in the neck at 0640 on a Tuesday. Convoy approach. Eastern route. The shot came from the ridge 800 meters, roughly, based on the time of flight estimate. Clean. No warning, no second shot, no evidence of a second position. One shot. Rimat Ullah fell between the lead vehicle and the supply truck and was dead before anyone reached him. The convoy retreated. The route was flagged. I wrote it down. The time, the position, the angle of approach. I noted that it was a Tuesday and the light had that particular winter quality, coming in low and almost horizontal, casting the ridge in shadow while the valley road below sat in full exposure. I noted it because I'd been trained to note everything, not because I thought the light mattered. The second death came 4 days later. Sergeant Major Tausif Beg. Different day, a Wednesday, different route, different approach vector. Shot from an elevated position on the western perimeter, which contradicted the first shot entirely in terms of source. The immediate assessment was 2 snipers. 2 independent operators, coordinated but distinct. Both shots were single round, no follow-up. Both clean. The third, fourth, and fifth deaths clustered across a 5-day stretch. Different times of morning. Different positions. At least 3 distinct shooter locations, possibly 4. By the 7th death, we had stopped running supply convoys in full daylight. By the 10th, we had constructed a partial night movement protocol that lasted 3 days before a convoy was hit at 2,230 under partial cloud cover, which meant either the shooters had thermal optics or they had very good intelligence about our schedules. By the 14th death, we had stopped running convoys entirely. And, the town of Daraka's 11,000 permanent residents, 4,000 displaced persons in the camp north of the market district had run out of insulin, 3 categories of antibiotics, and infant formula. The hospital was on a quarter generator because we couldn't route fuel through. The backup generator was 1 stress cycle from failure. The head physician, a Dr. Nazreen Abbasi who had not left the facility in 11 days, sent me a message that read, "We are not a trauma ward. We are a countdown." I read it. I wrote it in my log. I couldn't think of anything to add. On the 18th day, Colonel Motbul, my commanding officer for Sector 7, a man with the posture of someone perpetually braced for incoming critique, spread a map across the briefing table and said, 8 confirmed shooter positions. 8 separate locations. No triangulation. No pattern. 18 dead in 18 days and I cannot give command a single actionable assessment. What does that tell you, Dawood? It told me we had a pattern we couldn't read. Nothing yet, I said, which was accurate, and I wrote it down. She came in through the side door. Not the main entrance, not the corridor with the 2 guards who check credentials with the weary efficiency of men who've performed this action so many times it has ceased to require consciousness. The side door was a storage access point, technically locked, and she had bypassed both of those facts with a practiced indifference that communicated, without words, that this was not the first room she'd entered without clearance. She was carrying 2 things. A rolled map under her left arm and a notebook in her right hand. The notebook had a standard government-issue brown cover, the kind issued in bulk, entirely interchangeable, the kind that accumulates in desk drawers across every office in the country. But, someone had written across its cover in blue ink. A different hand than hers, I'd later understand. Larger letters. Slightly uneven. I couldn't read it from where I sat. I didn't ask, at that point. Later, I would be glad I hadn't asked. She was 26. She looked 19 from certain angles and moved with the considered economy of someone much older. Not cautious. Deliberate. There's a difference. Caution is about fear, deliberateness is about not wanting to move twice when once is sufficient. Colonel Motbul said, from across the table, "Who are you?" She said, "Zara Malik. Civilian pattern analyst, contracted under the Regional Emergency Intelligence Protocol. You can verify that through Deputy Commissioner Syed's office. It takes about 15 minutes. Or you can listen to me for 10 and save yourself the time." The 3 seconds of silence that followed were of a specific type, not hostile silence, not considering silence, but the kind that happens when a room's collective processing speed has been exceeded. Then, she unrolled her map over Colonel Motbul's map directly on top of it, without asking, with the same calm indifference she'd applied to the locked door, and it was covered in markings. Not standard military notation. Not the 8 confirmed positions we'd been charting in red. Different marks entirely. Small circles, annotated in handwriting so compressed I had to lean forward. Each circle had a time next to it. And, next to the time, a notation I didn't immediately recognize. Shadow angle. Followed by a degree measurement. The snipers are not choosing positions based on approach vectors, she said. They're not running a conventional suppression pattern, they're not targeting high-value personnel specifically, they're not responding to intelligence about convoy schedules. She tapped the map. They're working from a shadow map. They're positioning to where the shadow falls longest, wherever the contrast between lit ground and dark ground is sharpest. A shooter in deep shadow looking out at a fully lit approach road doesn't need exceptional skill. The target is silhouetted. The shooter is invisible. She looked around the room. There were 5 of us. None of us spoke. It's been winter, she continued. low sun angle, long shadows, consistent geometry. The positions that appear random to your analysis are rotating with the light. Every position on this map corresponds to a shadow angle of between 15 and 25 degrees on the eastern face at the time of each incident. She paused. All 18 of them. Colonel Mokbul said, "That's circumstantial." "That's a pattern imposed on data, write it down," she said. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at me, at my notebook, specifically, which had been open on the table since before she entered. "Write down what I said. Put a date on it. You'll want it later." I wrote it down. She rolled her map back up, tucked it under her arm, and went out through the side door without waiting to be dismissed. Mokbul spent 40 minutes explaining why she was a liability, an irregularity, and a probable security concern. I wrote this down too, not because I agreed but because I've found that writing down what people say in the moment they're dismissing something important creates a useful record. A timestamp. The exact coordinate of the moment before everything changed. I verified her credentials while he was talking. She was exactly what she'd said: civilian contract analyst, regional emergency intelligence protocol, current authorization. Her file was thin and not particularly flattering in its framing. A degree in applied mathematics from Quetta University. A 6-month field attachment to the Regional Intelligence Coordination Office. One performance note from a superior, the entirety of which read, "Demonstrates unconventional pattern recognition. Significant interpersonal difficulties. Results oriented to the point of abrasiveness." I've been described in similar terms. I've found it's usually written by people who had expected something else and found themselves, instead, confronted with something that worked. I also found her brother's file, because it was filed 2 entries above hers, and the names were the same, and I am, for better and for worse, a man who reads the adjacent file. Bilal Malik. 23 years old at time of death. Killed by sniper fire. Sector 4, 3 years prior. He'd been a medical orderly attached to a rapid response unit, not a combatant, a support asset. He'd returned to a casualty who'd been marked unrecoverable by the field assessment team, which is to say he'd gone back for someone that everyone else had written off, which is either foolish or something I don't have a word for, and was shot at 0647 on a Thursday morning from an eastern elevation. Low winter light. Long shadows on the approach. I closed the file. I didn't open it again for 4 days. There is a ritual to waiting that nobody teaches you. You learn it in the field, accumulated across deployments, across the specific texture of hours when nothing can be done until a supply shipment arrives, or a weather window opens, or an assessment comes back, and the waiting is not passive, it is its own kind of work, a maintenance of readiness, a management of the attention so that when the moment arrives you haven't spent yourself in the interval. I am decent at waiting. Mokbul is not. He rebriefed the same positions twice in 3 days, not because new information had arrived but because the briefing gave him something to do with his hands. I used the 4 days to go back through the incident reports. I read all 18, sequentially, chronologically, with Zara Malik's shadow angle framework running as a parallel track in my mind. I am not a pattern analyst. I don't have the training or the instinct she described. But I could apply her framework retroactively, and the more I applied it, the more what had looked like random distribution began to look like something else, like a wheel turning, cycling through positions on a schedule governed not by human decision but by geometry. By the angle of winter light on an eastern ridge. On the 3rd day, I called her. She answered on the first ring, which told me she'd been waiting for the call, or had been waiting for some call, and had learned to answer quickly before whoever was calling talked themselves out of it. "The map you presented," I said. "The 14 positions. You said you'd walked them." "Yes." "Over 6 days." "Yes." "Alone." A pause. Not the pause of someone who found the question unusual, but of someone deciding how much of the answer to give. I had a guide for 2 of the positions. He stopped after the second one. Another pause. He made a reasonable decision. I kept going. I sat with that. "Why didn't you come to us first? Before you walked them?" Because I needed to be right, she said. It came out with no particular emphasis. Not defensive. Not explanatory. Just factual, the way you state the load-bearing requirements of a bridge before you'll agree to stand on it. If I'd come to you with the analysis before I had physical confirmation, you would have dismissed it in the first briefing and I would have lost the access. I needed the evidence before I needed the audience. I thought about the 18 names on the whiteboard outside my office. About what it would have cost in time, in lives running the countdown at the hospital if she'd miscalculated. Either her assessment or her instinct about when to surface it. What if you'd been wrong? I said. Another pause. Longer. I wasn't, she said, and ended the call. The lights arrived on the fourth day, at 1400, in 3 transport vehicles that had been routed around the sector perimeter on the northern bypass, a road that was technically not rated for the weight but had been used before without incident, which is the specific category of risk that most military logistics decisions live in. 11 industrial lighting rigs. Each one capable of casting a 200-meter flood at full power, adjustable from 60 to 160 degrees of spread. They were the kind of equipment used on mining sites and stadium construction. They had orange warning stickers on the side and the faint smell of hydraulic fluid and, somewhere, a manufacturer's guarantee that I found quietly surreal in its optimism. Zara Malik was at the staging area when they arrived. She was not supposed to be. The staging area was a restricted logistics point, and her contract authorization covered analysis functions, not field deployment, and she was there anyway, standing next to the lead vehicle with a clipboard and a tape measure, verifying the flood geometry specifications against the measurements in her notebook. When she saw me approach, she didn't look up from the clipboard. The third unit has a defective mount bracket, she said. It won't hold the required elevation angle under sustained use. I've marked it. You'll want it repaired before deployment or it'll fail during the first convoy window. I looked at the third unit. There was a small yellow sticky note on the mount bracket. Neat handwriting. Precise notation of the defect. You've been here how long? I said. Since they left the supply point, she said. I tracked the routing. She looked up then, and I saw for the first time, perhaps the first real time, in the way you see someone's face when you've stopped trying to assess them and have simply looked, that she was tired. Not operationally tired. The deeper kind. The kind that doesn't come from insufficient sleep. I needed to check them before they were deployed. I'm the one who spec'd them. If they fail because I didn't verify, that's mine. That's mine, not that's a problem or that's a failure. Personal. Specific. A ledger she was maintaining in her head where the debits and credits were measured in something other than money. I thought about her brother's file. About a man who went back for someone already written off. Get the mount fixed, I said. And brief the deployment team. You know the positions better than anyone. She looked at me for a moment with the focused attention of someone recalibrating an estimate. You read my brother's file, she said. It wasn't a question. I read the adjacent file, I said. It's a habit. She looked back at the clipboard. Don't use it. Don't reference it in briefings or reports or when you're trying to get someone to listen to me. Her voice was the same as it always was, level, without inflection, carrying everything in its content and nothing in its tone. I got here on the analysis. Leave it on the analysis. Understood, I said. She made a small notation in her notebook. Closed it with both hands. I noticed, for the first time, that the name written on the cover in that larger, slightly uneven script was just a name. Bilal. Just the one word. Signed, because it was signed, not just written. There was a small cursive flourish at the end that no one makes unless they're putting their mark on something. She put the notebook in her jacket pocket and went to brief the deployment team, and I stood there in the staging area with the hydraulic smell of the lighting rigs and the cold afternoon air coming down off the ridge, and I wrote in my log, day 22. Lights in. Third unit defect caught and flagged. She found it before we did. She carries his name into every position she's walked. I don't know what that costs. I think it costs everything. I think she pays it anyway. That night, I sat in my office with the window angled toward the ridge and the town below it. The hospital generators hummed just barely audible if the wind was right, the lights of Derica's scattered and reduced by the outages but still there, still holding, and I thought about what she'd said. I needed to be right. I've worked in intelligence for 12 years. I've worked with analysts who needed to be seen to be right, who needed the credit, who needed the confirmation of the room turning to look at them. I've worked with analysts who needed to be right so they could be promoted, or respected, or left alone. I'd never worked with one who needed to be right the way a structural engineer needs to know the weight capacity before the bridge is occupied. Not because of what it would do for her. Because of what it would cost if she wasn't. The next convoy was scheduled for the morning after the lights were tested and positioned. 3 routes. The lighting rigs deployed along 2 of them. Zara would be at the observation point above Route Kilo, the same route that had lost 2 people 5 days prior, with her map, her notebook, and whatever it is she carries that I don't have a name for. I wrote in the log, tomorrow. The lights go on. Let's see what moves. The lights went on at 0530. That is not a metaphor. I want to be precise about that, because the whole operation, everything that happened in the next 72 hours, every decision and its consequence, every moment of what I'm going to try to describe, all of it runs from a single practical fact. At 0530, 11 industrial lighting rigs powered up along 2 convoy approach routes, and the pre-dawn mountain dark that had been the sniper network's primary tactical environment became, in the space of about 40 seconds, something else entirely. I was at the command post. I had a radio and my notebook and a cup of tea that had gone cold in the time between making it and sitting down, which is the specific fate of every cup of tea I've ever made in a field position. I was not at the observation point. I had wanted to be. Makbul had vetoed it on grounds that he needed me at the post for real-time assessment, and I hadn't pushed back because he was technically correct and also because I could see Zara's position from the command post through field glasses if the morning was clear enough. It was clear. Cold, still, the air before dawn in that particular mountain country way that makes everything visible and nothing warm. At 0531, 1 minute after the lights came on, I raised the field glasses and found her position on the slope above Route Kilo. She was already there. She'd been there, I'd learn later, since 0400. An hour and a half in the dark, in a forward observation hollow she'd identified from her recon, lying flat on a military issue mat with her map pinned flat by 2 stones and a notebook open on her left elbow. Through the field glasses, from 400 meters, I could see the shape of her and nothing more. The darkness made everything silhouette and inference. But I could see that she was still. The kind of still that requires active effort, the controlled breathing, the suppressed reflex, the body made into a piece of equipment by the mind deciding it's a piece of equipment. The first convoy moved at 0545. 15 vehicles. Fuel, medical supplies, 4 pallets of infant formula that Dr. Abbasi had been requesting for 9 days. I know what was in those vehicles because I'd inventoried the manifest twice, the night before, in the way I sometimes do things twice when I need the doing of them to feel like action. The convoy reached the first waypoint at 0601. The second waypoint at 0618. The radio stayed quiet. No contact. No shots. The vehicles moved through the lit corridor like boats in a harbor, steady, visible, suddenly, improbably safe. They reached Daraqaz at 0647. I wrote the time in my log and then sat with my pen still touching the paper, not writing anything else, just touching it. 15 vehicles. All present. I thought about the infant formula in the back of the 4th truck. I thought about the hospital countdown. I thought about Remat Ollah's daughter saying probably in a yellow dress somewhere. I didn't write any of that. I just sat. The lights had worked. That should be the end of a chapter in any story that's following the standard architecture of problem and solution. But the shooters moved. This was not unexpected. Zara had predicted it explicitly, the day she'd laid out her 3 scenarios. They'll adjust, she'd said. I need to be watching when they do. The lights had disrupted their primary advantage, and a network that had been operating with that level of tactical precision was not going to absorb the disruption and collapse. They were going to find a new geometry. At 0900, the day after the first successful convoy, she came into the briefing room main entrance this time, through the front, after the guards had verified her credentials and waved her through with the particular boredom of people who've now done this enough times that she is no longer an irregularity but a fixture, and she put a new map on the table. They moved overnight, she said. 3 of the 14 original positions have been vacated. Physical evidence confirms, positions cleared, shell casings retrieved, temporary fixtures removed. They're disciplined. They don't leave much. She indicated 3 circles on the new map, each marked with a small X, but they left enough. Where are they moving to? Makbul said. I don't know yet, she said. That's what I'm going to find out today. Makbul looked at her. You're going back out? Yes. To find new sniper positions. To find where they're establishing new ones. Before they establish them. She looked at him steadily. That's the window. They've been disrupted. They're in transition. There's a 12 to 24-hour period before their new positions are fully set up and operational. During that period, they're more exposed and I'm more likely to see where they're going. She paused. If I wait until they're settled, I've lost the window. Makbul started. I can't authorize a civilian. You authorized the purchase order, I said. He looked at me. And the lights. And the contract extension. I closed my notebook. We're past the authorization argument. She's been right 3 times. Let her work. He was quiet for a moment. The quiet of a man who has a bureaucratic objection and a practical problem and is realizing, in real time, which one he can afford to prioritize. Take a radio, he said to her. And take someone with you. She looked at me. I looked back at her. I'll go, I said. I wasn't sure why I said it. I wrote it down later, in the log, trying to figure out my own reasoning, and the best I could come up with was, I've been reading the adjacent file for 22 days. I want to see what I've been reading. She walked fast. Not the aggressive fast of someone trying to prove something, but the efficient fast of someone for whom the distance between A and B is a variable to minimize because time is the only resource she actually cares about. I am not slowed. 12 years of field work keeps a person at a reasonable baseline, but she moved through the terrain with a fluency that suggested she'd been here before. Which she had. 6 days of solo reconnaissance before she'd ever asked anyone to believe her. We didn't talk much in the first 40 minutes. She navigated, I followed. She checked her map twice, both times without slowing, just a quick glance and a micro-adjustment to bearing. She'd annotated the map, not just the positions, but small labels for terrain features, slope grades, sightline obstructions. The level of detail was the level of someone who had learned the hard way that the note you didn't make is the one that kills you. On a ridge crossing, she stopped. Just stopped, mid-step, with the abruptness of a system receiving an interrupt. I stopped too. I followed her sightline. About 300 meters north of us, in a shallow saddle between 2 rock faces, there was a boy. He looked about 9 or 10. He was sitting on a flat stone with his back against the rock face, eating something from a cloth bundle in his lap, with the unhurried self-possession of a child who has no idea that the specific geography he's chosen as his lunch spot is the same geography that a sniper network has been surveying for relocation. Zara looked at her map. She looked at the boy. She looked at the map again. He's in the secondary-primary corridor, she said quietly. If they're establishing where I think they're establishing, that saddle is going to be a high-activity zone within the next 6 to 8 hours. He's a local, I said. Probably grazing goats somewhere nearby. Yes. She was still looking at him. He needs to not be there. If we approach him directly, we're in the open, and if anyone is already pre-scouting the position, I know, she said. She folded the map precisely. Put it away. Looked at the boy for another moment with the concentrated attention of someone running calculations that have a human at the end of them. I'll go. I'm a civilian. If someone's watching, one woman approaching a child reads differently than a woman and an officer. That's a significant exposure, I said. He's 9, she said. She was already moving. I watched from cover while she approached the boy. I had the radio in my hand and the field glasses in the other end, the specific kind of helplessness that is the feeling of watching someone else take a risk you've been unable to think of an alternative to. She came around the lower rock face into the saddle from a direction that put the boys back to the open slope so that anyone watching from elevation would see her first, and him second, protected by her position. She didn't run. Didn't crouch. Walked with the ordinary pace of a woman walking toward a child, and stopped a few meters away and crouched down to his level and said something. I couldn't hear it. But I watched his face, visible even at this distance through the field glasses, go from startled to listening to, after a moment, something that might have been persuaded. He folded his cloth bundle. He stood up. He followed her back around the rock face, away from the saddle. She walked him for about 200 meters and pointed him downhill toward the road, and he went. She watched him until he was on the road. Then, she stood there for a moment, just a moment, with her back to me, not moving, before she turned and came back. When she reached me, she was looking at her map again. The boy was already a notation she'd filed and moved past. What did you tell him? I said. That his goats had gotten onto the south road and his uncle was looking for him. She didn't look up from the map. I don't know if he has an uncle. But everyone has an uncle. We found the first of the new positions at 11:30. It was a slot in the rock face above the northern approach road, roughly 600 meters from the road surface, with a view corridor that bypassed all 6 of our lighting rig placements. Clever. Genuinely clever, not the clever of someone improvising under pressure, but the clever of someone who had looked at our countermeasure and found its geometry and identified the blind spot. Whoever was running this network, they weren't panicking. They were thinking. Zara stood at the edge of the slot and looked out along the view corridor. I stood behind her and waited. She didn't say anything for 30 seconds. Then, 40. Then, a minute. I was about to say something, I'm not sure what, some operational prompt, some check-in, when I saw her hands. She was holding the notebook. She'd opened it at some point without my noticing. But she wasn't writing in it. She was holding it against her chest with both hands, spine out, the way you hold something when you need a physical anchor and reach for the nearest solid thing. And she was looking down the sightline. Down the corridor. Toward the road. Not assessing it. Not calculating. Just looking at it with something in her face I hadn't seen in the 3 days I'd been in the same room as her, something that had no tactical application, something that was just open. A wound left open. The view corridor was east-facing. Low sun angle. Long shadow on the approach road below. 800 meters, roughly. The same as Route Kilo. The same as a Thursday morning 3 years ago. I didn't speak. I stood behind her and didn't move and didn't write anything and let the silence be what it needed to be, which was hers. It lasted perhaps another 30 seconds. Then, I saw her jaw set. Not gradually, not a slow return to composure, not the soft edges of someone coming back from an internal place. A set. A specific, deliberate, mechanical engagement of the muscles that hold a face still, the same way you engage a safety on a weapon. A thing done with intention. And, then, the anger came. I could see it happen. It moved through her like a current finding ground, her shoulders, her hands, the way she gripped the notebook and then put it away with a decisive snap. Something hot and familiar settling into the cavity where the other thing had been. Not rage. Not grief redirected. Something she knew. Something she could use. A tool she'd been reaching for long enough that the reaching had become automatic. Angle 22 degrees on the eastern face, she said. Her voice was exactly as it had always been. Level. Precise. Carrying everything in its content and nothing in its tone. This is the primary. They'll have a secondary establishment to the northeast, 400 meters from here, above the fuel depot road. She turned away from the corridor and was already pulling the map out. We need to move. I followed her. I wrote nothing in my log while we were moving. I wrote it that night, back at the post, in the specific shorthand I use for things I don't want to flatten by being too precise. She went somewhere. I don't know how long she's been going there. I don't know how far it is. I know she came back the way a person comes back when they've made themselves come back, not because the thing result, but because they looked at it and they chose. She carries his name on the cover. She carries his sightline in her chest. I don't know what I'd call that. I know it's not weakness. We found the secondary position at 1300 and the tertiary at 1545. 3 new positions, all identified, all mapped, all outside our existing lighting coverage by deliberate margin. The network had pivoted in under 24 hours. It was impressive, operationally. It was the kind of impressive that makes you understand why the problem had lasted 18 days, why 8 confirmed positions had produced no pattern, why the assessment team had been running in circles, because whoever was running this operation was not making human scale errors. They were methodical. Patient. They understood geometry the way Zara understood geometry, as a language, a fixed set of relationships that doesn't lie and doesn't improvise. On the walk back, she said, there are 3 shooters. Not 2, not 4. 3. Your original analysis suggested. My original analysis was based on the first 8 positions. With the 3 new ones and the positioning logic, it's 3. 1 primary, the one setting the methodology, choosing the positions. 2 secondaries who execute. She paused. The primary is the one I need to understand. What do you mean, understand? She was quiet for a moment. The shadow mapping. The position rotation. The response to the lighting rigs, the way they adjusted, the specific geometry of the new positions. She looked at the map without looking at it. This isn't a trained military protocol. It's not from a manual. Someone worked this out themselves. From first principles. A pause. I want to know how they thought about it. You want to know how the person who's been killing our people thinks, I said. I want to know how they see the light, she said. Because that's what this is. All of it. A conversation about where the light falls. I wrote that down that night too. A conversation about where the light falls. She said it the way you say something you've been thinking for a long time and have finally found the exact word for. That night, Mock Bull pushed me on a timeline. She's found the new positions, he said. Counter placement takes 48 hours. We move the rigs, re-establish the lighting envelope, run the convoy window. She doesn't think the rigs are the full solution anymore, I said. He stopped. The positions they've moved to, 2 of them are in terrain the rigs can't effectively reach. The geometry is wrong. They've scouted for our blind spots specifically. I opened my notebook. She has a different approach for the final phase. What approach? She needs tonight to finish it, I said. She hasn't told me yet. There was a silence on Mock Bull's end that had a specific quality, the silence of a man who was deciding whether to trust an assessment he can't yet see. Dawood, he said, if this doesn't work in the next 48 hours, Command is sending in a counter-sniper team from the north. I know. The counter-sniper team will establish a 5-kilometer cordon, which means 48 hours minimum lockdown, civilian displacement, active conflict in the market district, 3 more deaths in the hospital from supply denial. I'd run the numbers. They weren't complicated. I know what it means. Then, you understand the timeline. She understands the timeline, I said. Better than either of us. I ended the call and went to find her. She was in a storage room off the main corridor that someone had set up as a workspace, a table, a lamp, her maps spread out with weights on the corners. She was writing in the notebook. Not the brown government issue one. A different one, newer, with a plain cover and no writing on it. Pages of calculations. Number sequences I didn't recognize immediately, and then did sun angle tables. Seasonal correction factors. Shadow migration rates at different elevations. She was rebuilding the primary shooter's methodology from the inside. Working out how they had thought, in order to work out where they would think next. I need until morning, she said without looking up. You have until morning, I said. And, I need the shooting incident reports. All 18. The timestamps and the exact positions. I'll get them. She nodded. Made a notation. I was almost out the door when she said, Captain Farrick. I stopped. The boy this morning, she said. In the saddle. Yes. Is there a system for tracking them? The children who use those routes? A way to know they're clear before a convoy window? I thought about it. There wasn't. There wasn't anything like that. It wasn't the kind of thing that gets systematized because it requires you to acknowledge, formally, that the routes are dangerous in ways that make children targets of circumstance, and that kind of acknowledgement generates paperwork that nobody wants to write. There isn't, I said. She was quiet for a moment. There should be. Yes, I said. There should. She went back to her calculations. I went and pulled the 18 incident reports. I delivered them to her at 2100 and she didn't look up when I set them on the table. I stood there for a moment and I thought about saying something about the saddle, about the view corridor, about the way her hands had looked holding the notebook against her chest at an angle of 22 degrees on the eastern face. I didn't say anything. I went back to my office and wrote in my log, by lamplight, with the faint hum of the hospital generator audible on the still mountain air, she's building his mind. The shooters. Disassembling his logic to find where it lives. It's the same thing she did with the shadow map. She didn't look at what had happened. She looked at how someone would have to think for what happened to make sense. I think that's what makes her dangerous. Not the mathematics. The empathy. She can get inside a way of seeing. I wonder, sometimes, if that's something she developed after Bilal. Or something she had before, that he also had, that they got from the same place. I wrote that down and, then, didn't look at it again. She presented the final plan at 0600. There were 6 of us in the room. Makbul, myself, 2 operations officers whose names I'll keep out of this account, the radio technician Corporal Yassin who had been awake for 22 hours and, whose presence was less optional than it appeared, and Zara Malik, who had clearly not slept and carried this fact on her person like a piece of issued equipment she didn't want to complain about. The maps were new. Not just annotated, fully redrawn. She'd spent the night reconstructing them from the 18 incident reports and her own recon data, and what she'd produced was something I've spent weeks since trying to adequately describe in this log. Not a map of positions. A map of a mind. Every position plotted not just by location but by the sequence in which they'd been occupied, the time gaps between activations, the rotation logic, the estimated observation schedule between shots. She'd turned 18 incidents into a biography of a way of seeing. 3 shooters, she said. Primary, secondary alpha, secondary beta. She used a pen to trace lines between positions. The primary selects. Secondary alpha and beta execute. The communication between them is not radio. We've been scanning and finding nothing because they're not using conventional frequencies. They're using light signals. She paused, giving that a moment to land. Mirrors. Small, directional. The primary signals the secondaries from elevated positions. Short burst, specific angle. The secondaries confirm and position accordingly. The room was quiet. That's why we couldn't triangulate them on radio intercept, said one of the operations officers. Yes, she said. It's also why the shadow positioning matters doubly. They need line of sight for the mirror signals, which means they're always choosing positions with clear mutual visibility as well as target visibility. That constraint actually makes them more predictable than they realize. She put the pen down. And it's the center of what I'm going to use. Makbul said, you're going to disrupt the signals. I'm going to corrupt them, she said. There's a difference. If I disrupt, if I block the signal corridor, they abort and reposition. I've already seen them adapt once. They'll do it again. She pulled out the plain notebook, the one with the calculations. But, if I corrupt the signal, if I introduce a false confirmation into the sequence, then, secondary alpha or secondary beta moves to a position that the primary didn't order. And, when the primary looks for confirmation from the position they intended, they get silence from where they expected acknowledgement. She looked up. The network mistakes itself for compromised. They don't know whether they've been infiltrated or whether one of the secondaries has been taken. The protocol, when a shooter suspects position compromise, is immediate withdrawal. You're going to make them think they've been caught, I said. I'm going to make them think one of their own has been caught and has talked, she said. Which triggers the most aggressive version of the withdrawal protocol. She looked at the map. But, the withdrawal routes go through 3 specific corridors. Because the terrain doesn't offer other options. And, those corridors, she indicated 3 points on the map, are where I need you. The technical problem of mirror signal interception is not a simple one. Zara spent 45 minutes walking Corporal Yassine through the optics setup she needed, a directional reflector mounted on a specific elevation, calibrated to match the signal wavelength and pulse pattern she'd observed from the primary position during her night recon, which is to say, while I'd been sleeping, she'd been lying on a hillside above the 3rd new position in the dark, timing and recording mirror pulses with a stopwatch and a piece of paper. The record is in her notebook. I've read it. It is exactly as precise as everything else she does, written in the same small handwriting, dated and timestamped and followed immediately by a note that reads, wind NNW at 12 km per hour. Signal clear at 400 m. Signal degraded at 600 m. Primary and secondary alpha share line of sight. Secondary beta communicates through relay. There is a 4th position I haven't found yet. A 4th position. A relay point. A person whose job was not to shoot but to pass the signal from primary to the secondary when terrain interrupted direct line of sight. She'd found this at 0300, alone on a hillside, and written it down and incorporated it into the plan before she presented anything to any of us. I thought about that while Yassine was configuring the reflector. I thought about what it costs to see a thing at 0300 that changes your plan and then sit with it alone until morning while the people who need to know are asleep, unable to be woken, and you adjust and recalculate in the dark by yourself because that is the job you've assigned yourself and you're going to do it right or not at all. I thought, she's been doing this alone for a long time. Not just here. Somewhere before here, too. The operation ran from 0845 to 1130. I'll give you the operational facts first, because they are the structure the rest of this account hangs on, and because I think structure, the bare bones of sequence, helps you understand how much was built on top of it. At 0845, Yassine activated the reflector from the relay position. A single pulse, matching the primary signal pattern. At 0851, secondary alpha moved to the wrong position. To the position that the false signal had indicated, 300 meters west of where the primary had positioned them. At 0853, the primary would have been expecting confirmation from secondary alpha at the intended position. The intended position was silent. At 0856, we intercepted the secondary alpha confirmation signal from the wrong position, which is to say, secondary alpha had arrived at the false location and was attempting to confirm it. The primary's response was not captured, but its consequence was, at 0902, secondary beta, who would have received a signal from the primary indicating possible compromise, began moving to the withdrawal corridor. At 0910, secondary beta was in the first withdrawal corridor, between 2 rock faces, with no shot angle and no sightline and 2 of our units waiting. At 0910 and roughly 30 seconds, secondary beta put down his weapon. I heard it on the radio, a burst of movement, shouted instructions, a silence that preceded the voice of one of our operations officers saying, with a flatness that communicated something other than flatness, we have one. At 0947, secondary alpha, having received no primary confirmation and no beta signal, and being positioned in a location that made no tactical sense, made the same calculation and exited through the second corridor. Secondary alpha was 22 years old. He cried when he came through the corridor. Not from fear, or not only from fear, there was something else in it that I couldn't name in the moment. I thought about it later. I still don't have the right word. At 10:50, the primary shooter made his move. This is the part I've rewritten 3 times. Not because the facts are unclear, they're precise, I have them logged, but because I was there, and what I remember is not an operational sequence. What I remember is a very specific series of moments that I've been trying to understand. The primary withdrawal route ran through a corridor above the eastern ridge, at a point where 2 rock faces converged and created a natural channel approximately 4 meters wide. We'd positioned 2 units at the channel's exit, standard coverage. The withdrawal protocol required the primary to pass through the channel and down the eastern slope to a concealed vehicle route below. Zara was with me at an observation point above the channel. We were not the arrest team that was below us. We were watching. She had her map and her notebook, and I had the radio and the field glasses and the cold, mid-morning, shadowless air that had arrived with the sun now high enough to eliminate the geometry she'd spent 3 weeks charting. At 10:47, movement in the upper channel. I raised the glasses. The primary shooter came through the upper entrance of the channel with the controlled, specific movement of someone following a practiced withdrawal route, no hurry, no panic, the particular efficiency of a person who was prepared for exactly this contingency. He was carrying a pack and a rifle case and moving with the compact care of a professional. He was young. That's what hit me. He was young in a way that came through the field glasses like a fact you didn't ask for, maybe 20, maybe slightly over, with the unmarked face of someone who hasn't been carrying what he's been carrying long enough for it to show. He moved like someone competent and very young, and those 2 things together created a particular sensation in my chest that I didn't write down immediately because I wasn't sure how. At 10:53, the arrest team at the channel exit made contact. He stopped. He stood very still. He put the rifle case down on the rock, not dropped, put down, carefully, one controlled motion, and then put the pack down, and then raised both hands. At 10:54, I lowered the field glasses and looked at Zara. She was watching the channel below us. Both hands on her binoculars. Her face doing nothing visible, which was itself a kind of doing something. I wanted to say something. I didn't know what. I searched myself for the appropriate thing and found nothing that wasn't either too large or too small for what was happening. She lowered the binoculars. She looked at the primary shooter, now on his knees in the channel, hands being secured, the arrest team moving around him with the practiced efficiency of people doing what they have been trained to do. She looked at him for a long time. Then, she looked at her notebook. The government issue brown one, with the name on the cover. She held it in both hands and looked at it, not open, just held. The spine out. The same way she'd held it in the slot above Route Kilo 2 days before, at an angle of 22 degrees, looking down a shadow corridor at a road where someone had died with the same geometry. She opened it. She found a blank page near the back. She wrote something. I didn't ask what. Later, not that day, but later, in a different conversation in a different room, she told me. She'd written the same thing she wrote every time she opened to a new page. A calibration note. Wind direction, temperature, elevation, time. The same data she recorded at every position, every observation, every field note. Automatism as a life raft. The routine of record keeping is the thing that kept the hands moving when the hands needed to keep moving. She closed the notebook. She said, "It's done." And then, she walked down the slope toward the channel, and I followed, because I didn't know what else to do except follow the person who knew where we were going. I saw him up close only once. The primary shooter. I'm going to call him that here rather than use his name, because his name is in the official record and this account is not the official record. The official record is accurate and complete and does not contain what I'm trying to put here. He was sitting against the rock face of the channel, hands secured, with the controlled stillness of someone who has been in difficult positions before and has learned not to make them worse by moving. He was looking at the ground. When the arrest team moved him to standing for transport, he looked up, and his eyes passed across me and then stopped at Zara. She was standing 5 meters away. She hadn't approached him. She wasn't going to approach him, there was no operational reason for her to, and she's not a person who does things without operational reason, or at least that's what I'd understood about her up to that point. But she looked at him. He looked back at her. There was a moment, I will not tell you it lasted longer than it did, it lasted perhaps 4 seconds, in which two people who had been thinking about each other for weeks without knowing it stood in the same cold air and looked. I don't know what she saw. I know what I saw, a young man with a competent mind and a wasted application of it, doing something I couldn't understand from the outside and was not going to be able to understand from the inside. I know what a face looks like when it's holding something heavy. I know because I've looked at my own face in field mirrors after difficult days and it looks like that. He looked young enough to be her younger brother. I don't know if she thought that. I wrote it down that night and then stared at it for a while and then didn't cross it out. She didn't say anything to him. She turned and walked toward the slope exit, and Corporal Yassine fell in beside her, and the arrest team loaded the primary shooter into the transport vehicle, and I stood in the channel for a moment in the shadowless mid-morning light and tried to find something appropriate in myself and couldn't. I followed her out. The convoy that evening carried the remaining hospital supplies, the insulin restock, the second fuel delivery, and a message from Dr. Abbasi to the garrison commander that read, in its entirety, "Thank you. Please don't let this happen again." I've kept a copy of that message in my field log. Not because it's addressed to me, but because I think it's the most accurate summary of the operations cost and meaning that anyone wrote. The efficiency of thank you. The weight of don't let this happen again, and the implicit because I know you will, because this is what always happens, because the system that created the 18 days and the hospital countdown will produce them again somewhere. That's a different problem. Not her problem, not mine, not one that exists in the space where her analysis and my field log can reach. But I wrote it down. The debrief took 2 days. Maqbul ran it. It was thorough and accurate and credited the lighting rig countermeasure as the central operational achievement, which is not wrong exactly, but is the kind of not wrong that looks different depending on how much you know about the sequence of events and who was standing in which room on which day. I said this once in the debrief. Maqbul looked at me. I looked at my notebook. He moved on. After the debrief's second day, I found Zara in the same storage room workspace, packing her maps. She was folding them with the same precise thirds she'd used on every piece of paper she'd ever handed to someone. There is something about the way she folds a map that makes you understand she's done with a place, not angry with it, not sad, just finished, the way a calculation is finished when the last variable is resolved. They'll write you out of the record, I said. Not entirely. But the shape of the credit will be adjusted in the retelling. She looked up. I know, she said. I have it all written down, I said. Every conversation. Dated. Time-stamped. She looked at me for a moment with the specific expression I'd first seen in the doorway after the initial briefing, the look of a person who has had this conversation before, in different rooms, with different people who meant it and then were surprised when meaning it wasn't enough. I know you do, she said. That's not why I came here. Why did you come here? She was quiet. Not evasive quiet. Thinking quiet. The kind of quiet that's assembling something rather than avoiding it. There's a wall outside your office, she said. With names on it. Yes. When I came in the first day, I looked at it. I read all of them. She folded the last map. Put it in her bag. Bilal's name isn't on that wall. He was in a different sector. There's a different wall. Somewhere. She picked up her bag. I don't know where they keep it. I didn't know either. I wrote it down that night, the specific, small, unbearable bureaucratic fact of it, and then I looked into it, and it took me 11 days to find the record, and when I found it I called her and told her, and she was quiet on the line for a long time. But that's after this. In the storage room, on the day she left, she said, "You'll keep the log accurate?" Same question. Same doorway. Same phrasing, almost exactly. "I will," I said. She nodded. The small nod. The acknowledgement, not the agreement. She picked up the government-issue brown notebook last. She put it in her jacket pocket with both hands. Buttoned the pocket closed. The shadow geometry changes in spring, she said. When the sun angle changes. They'll need to re-evaluate the lighting rig placements in April. I'll note it. The relay position is still unconfirmed. We got the 3 main operators, but whoever was running the relay signal, I know, I said. We're looking. She looked at me for a moment. The expression she wore in that moment is one I've tried to describe in this log 4 separate times and failed 4 separate times, so I'll try once more. It was the expression of a person who was very tired, and very finished, and who has done the thing they came to do, and who is not sure genuinely, not performatively unsure, but the real kind, whether the thing being done is the same as the thing being over. Then, she went out through the main entrance. Front door. Past the guards who waved her through with the mild recognition of people who had seen her enough times that she was no longer notable. I sat in the storage room for a while after she left. The maps were gone. The plain notebook was gone. The table had the faint rectangular outlines of map corners where the weights had sat, and the lamp was still on, and from the window I could see the eastern ridge in the high clear light of an afternoon without shadows. I wrote in my log, day 33. Operation concluded. 3 operators detained. Routes secured. Hospital supply chains restored. Dr. Abbasi's message received and filed. Zara Malik departed at 15:20. I need to write down what she did, and I've been trying for 3 days, and the problem I keep running into is that the thing she did, the core of it, the part that made it possible, isn't in the operational record. It's not in the shadow map or the purchase order or the 19 calculations in the plain notebook. It's in the 6 days she walked positions alone before she asked anyone to listen. It's in the 4th position note she wrote at 0300 and didn't tell anyone about until morning. It's in the way she walked a child out of a saddle and watched him to the road. It's in the thing she carried, in her left breast pocket, in the specific way she buttoned it closed. I don't have a word for what that kind of work costs. I know what it looks like from the outside. I know it looks like competence, like method, like a woman with a map being right about the shadows. I know that's not the whole of it. I know because I've read the adjacent file. 2 weeks later, a convoy on Route Kilo was delayed by a mechanical failure and sat stationary on the approach road for 47 minutes during a window that Zara had flagged in a report I'd filed on her behalf after she'd left, because she hadn't had the clearance to file it directly as a potential re-emergence window for secondary network actors. Nothing happened. The convoy sat for 47 minutes and then continued and reached Dera Kaz without incident, and the driver of the 4th vehicle, a young man named Pervez who had been driving supply routes for 2 years without ever being delayed this long on this road, stepped out at the Dera Kaz depot and stood beside his truck for a moment in the afternoon light and did not appear to know what to do with the fact of still being there. I wasn't there. I heard about it from Corporal Yassine, who had been on the convoy as part of the monitoring team and who described Pervez as just standing there, Captain, just looking at the road like he couldn't figure it out. I wrote that in the log too. There is a kind of safety that is only visible to the people who know what it replaced. Pervez didn't know whose math had kept the shadows empty. Didn't know about the wall in the hallway or the notebook in the left breast pocket or the note written at 0300 on a hillside by a woman who needed to be right before she asked anyone to listen. He just stood beside his truck in the afternoon light. And looked at the road. And didn't know what to say about the particular fact of still being there. Neither did I. I still don't. The relay position was confirmed 6 weeks later. A different operation, different operators, different map. The name in the report file was listed simply as additional asset, network function unclear. I found Zara Malik's analysis from the week she'd identified the relay's existence, the 0300 note attached as a footnote in the intelligence annex. The footnote was attributed to civilian contractor, unspecified. I called Makbul. He said, that's how the record was filed. I said, I know. I wrote it down.